I want to move on to another topic, which is a massive story this week, which is office. David Cameron, who is now the Foreign Secretary, he's been on the media this morning. He was on Sky News earlier talking about this. Let's have a listen to what David Cameron had to say.
All I can say is I don't recall in any detail being briefed and being aware of the scale of this issue. But that's what the public inquiry is for. They must be able to. They must look at all the advice ministers received and all the action that was taken. No, I'll go further. No,
it's about you.
Yes.
Is there no part of you that is saying to yourself now that you, or Osborne, or Ed Davey, could have acted at some point to avert what is a scandal, but actually it's worse, a human tragedy?
I'd go further than that. I mean, first of all, this is an appalling miscarriage of justice. And anyone who's been involved in government in any way over the last 20 years has got to be extremely sorry, as I am, about what has happened.
This is fascinating, Michael Crick, isn't it, in terms of where the blame actually goes. Fascinating article in, I think it's the Sunday Times today, looking at who decided that Paula Venel should get her CBE, which she's now handed back. Personally, I'm not that... I don't think it's that big a deal whether she has a CBE or doesn't have a CBE, but certainly a decision was made during the Theresa May administration to give her a CBE. Some suggestion that that's because she was so strong and so tough on people saying that there were problems within the system, and she stood up to them, as some people would say. But David Cameron, it's interesting when you bring back people from sort of, you know, season one. Now we're in the sort of death throes probably of the Conservative administration, and because these problems do keep popping up. Give us your assessment both of what David Cameron was saying there and also Ed Davey's position this week, Michael.
Well, I think what's fascinating is the contrast between Cameron just there, who used the word sorry.
Yes.
And he's got a lot to be sorry for because it was his government. And it seems astonishing to me that, I mean, I used to read Private Eye, I still read Private Eye every fortnight.
Well, they were talking about it all the time.
And it just went on and on and on. And I kept saying to myself, I must do a story about this. The trouble is, I was a political journalist.
Yeah.
You know, to do a story like that requires time. But I'm not excusing myself. We all should have done it more as journalists. But certainly, bells should ring in government. I mean, I don't know, you'd probably be able to advise, you've worked in government. Is there a troubleshooter in Downing Street who reads Private Eye, reads all the trade press, reads everything and says, look, this is a problem that is getting worse, we've got to get a grip on it?
Funny enough, when I was in investment banking, every director had a subscription to Private Eye, specifically for that in the city section, because the idea was that you needed to be completely across the kind of characters that were being written about in Private Eye, who may at some point end up being a director of this company or whatever, that actually it was a go-to place to actually nail certain people that you didn't think were desirable.
But it's interesting in that Ian Hislop, the editor of Private Eye, got into a big row this week with Jake Berry, the former chairman of the Conservative Party, and my colleague, I should say, he presents programmes on talkTV as well, on the Robert Peston programme on ITV about this. But what I sensed a huge frustration from Ian Hislop, and I would be frustrated as well. If you've been banging on about this for 10 years, as they have, and I've read all those reports, to the extent that it was almost seemed repetitive, because it is quite a repetitive story, and then an ITV documentary drama comes along, and then suddenly everyone's interested in this story. Maybe Ian Hislop, the editor of Private Eye, should feel a bit frustrated by that, because his efforts perhaps weren't having the impact that they should have had.
Indeed, you know, it's astonishing, really, that it's taken a drama, not a documentary. There have been one or two documentaries. There was a series of radio programmes. There was a panorama presented by John Sweeney. You know, and there's a book being written about it. But none of that made anything like the impact as a drama. I think it helped probably that the drama came out over the Christmas period.
It's a bit quiet news-wise.
People have got the time to watch it.
A little bit quiet news-wise.
But going back to Cameron this morning, the contrast between him saying sorry and Ed Davey when he was asked by Paul Brand repeatedly, and the interview was arranged at 24 hours notice. 10 times Paul Brand asked him if he was sorry, and 10 times Ed Davey repeated the phrase, "Of course I regret," which is not going as far as sorry, and he just didn't want to do it, and he looked dreadful. I mean, this man is leader of the Liberal Democrats. He hopes to become Prime Minister. I'm not sure that's a very realistic ambition, but he could become Deputy Prime Minister. And I just don't understand why he didn't say I'm sorry.
And especially as he he knew that question was going to come, didn't he? I mean,
and he must have had advisors who went through, and so they prepared. I mean, you've done all this, advising ministers or politicians.
On both sides.
Yeah, and how to answer a question, and what do you do if the reporter asks the question again and again and again? Yeah. Well, you have variations of the answer, don't you? Which don't use the same formula of words.
Yes.
They say the same thing. But I mean, all of that, it was just, it was utterly amateur. It was utterly unsympathetic to the plight of the the sub-postmasters who've suffered dreadful.
Lucy, what do you make of what Davey said or indeed didn't say this?
Well, that was atrocious. I can't understand how he managed to get that far, to even in the middle of the interview thinking, actually, this isn't working, I really ought to change tack here. And the difference, as you say, the contrast with David Cameron, who literally has lanced that boil immediately. He just said, at the first opportunity, yes, I'm actually just going to say sorry. The English language is quite tricky because you can definitely say... a bit like, you know, when couples are going through a hard time, one of them might say, I'm sorry that I'm now sleeping in the spare room, which is not quite the same as saying I'm sorry that I cheated on you or whatever it might be. But actually the way in the contrition did seem very authentic.
I'm sorry you were offended.
Exactly.
I'm sorry if any offence was taken.
And I think the issue around the drama is simply because narratives and storytelling is how we function as human beings. It's how we...
Well, that's fascinating, isn't it?
Yes.
They sort of made sense of it by seeing fictional... character, based on real
people that you could identify with, human beings making cups of tea, having rows, getting in cars, going to work. This is we're very imitative creatures, and we respond to things that we recognise. So we're looking at that drama and thinking, oh my God, that could be me, that could have been my auntie, that could have been my grandfather, and it became much more relatable than reading some of the column. And this is where I feel sorry for Ian Hislop, because as much as they wrote about it in quite a dry way. Well, because it was quite a dry topic. It was basically actually, about a computer malfunction.
I mean, Private Eye doesn't do itself any favours by the way in which it's large lumps of text that is very small print.
Yes.
And quite off-putting to read.
Declare your interest.
I have made this point. But anyway, nonetheless, they did a brilliant job, as indeed did Computer Weekly.
Yes.
And and now, finally, progress is being made. But the extent of this problem is, I think, even greater than anybody realises. I mean, I went into... We spend, you know, a few weeks of the year... We spend a lot of time up in the north. And I went into a post office in the Lake District last week, or the week before, 10 days ago, and I said to the sub-postmaster, have you had any problems? He said, I did, yeah, and in fact, I'm so disgusted by the ITV drama, I'm resigning, I'm kicking the post office out of my shop, well, I'm not being a sub-postmaster anymore. And he said, you know, it was all right. I mean, I only lost a few thousand. But there were 3 people in this area within 5 miles who suffered much more. One was prosecuted, one suffered complete breakup of her family, had to sell the family home and so on. And if there are that many people within a short radius, you think, how many others are there who've just not bothered to come forward, who just sort of wrote the losses off, or may even still, well, I don't suppose they still feel it was their mistake. But it's...
There are lots of tentacles to this story, but actually from a wider perspective, it really speaks to how politicians could communicate more effectively about the things that they want to get across. And often people like Keir Starmer, previously Jeremy Corbyn, were mocked for the way in which they would use PMQs as an opportunity to say, I have a constituent, her name is Flossie, and this is what happened to her. And people would roll their eyes. But actually, it's those very personal stories. And the idea that you think your politician, your MP, your own personal MP, could actually make a difference to your life.
Well, we're actually going to be talking about that exact thing in terms of little people versus the system, essentially, and what we're told by technology. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in the programme.